Adaptations, remakes, reimaginations. The attempt to take a pre-existing piece of art and replicate it. Can it ever be accurately done? Can a piece be reflected in a mirror with perfect detail? Or does every mirror contain some form of imperfection, altered in hardly discernible to glaringly obvious ways? Every piece of art has a fingerprint of its creator, a one-of-a-kind signature that cannot be replicated, even when handled with care. There are too many factors: style, subtext, message, even the reception by the audience. While some factors can be emulated, it will never be a one-to-one comparison. Down in the lake house, the powers that be spent their time in this pursuit, to recreate the literature of Alan Wake for the purposes of control, to reign over the powers of the dark place, to make reality bend to their will, like Dr. Hartman before them. Diana wished to have her talents recognized as superior to her husband. Jules had a more nefarious goal: to erase Dr. Darling. His comments imply he may have sought a way to destroy Darling's legacy. In the furtherance of these goals, their strategy was to emulate Wake's writing. The two primary examples of this are the automatic typing devices and abducting Ed Booker to write for them. Different issues arise with these attempts. Let's go over both. The AI algorithm on the ATDs attempt to mimic the style of whatever template is given to them, fed pages and pages of Alan's work until it gets an idea of how he writes, what symbols he uses, the structure of his sentences, and meter of his voice. Using the metaphor of the fingerprint, it is essentially taking an impression of the pattern and duplicating it over and over. A photocopy. The issue is there will always be something missing. While a fingerprint can be falsified, the DNA cannot. The tangible aspect of the writing is present, but the abstract is absent. The ATD doesn't understand what it is writing. It has no frame of reference for a message to present to the audience, a purpose behind its efforts, only the physical act of writing for writing's sake. No art is involved in it because the computer doesn't have an inner world to project from. Guided by the hands of humans, it can be a tool, but if the story originates exclusively from the ATD, it cannot provide anything of substance. The infinite monkey theorem describes this dilemma. If you place a monkey on a typewriter and allow it to clack away, 99.9% of everything that happens will be random gibberish. Very rarely, a single word will appear among the din of chaotic symbols. Even more rarely, a sentence will present itself. If the monkey is allowed to infinitely write, in one reality, it will recreate the complete works of William Shakespeare in order. Based upon Jules' own research, emotion is an ingredient in the act of creation. The amount of emotion a piece of art contains can be measured. So, I ask this: what is the difference in emotion between Hamlet written by Shakespeare and Hamlet written by a monkey? A big difference. No thought or emotion went into the act. No care was placed into what effect the story will have on the audience. It cannot craft a narrative to make the audience feel because the ATD is incapable of feeling in the first place. Despite its ability to recreate style and symbols, it doesn't understand why. A computer cannot rationalize why Errand Boy is a short story designed to speak to Alan's missing father complex. The ATD would only see it as a story about immortal cannibals. What lies under the surface will forever be out of sight. As a result, if this AI is set near Cauldron Lake, as we see in the DLC, what these machines produce can have unforeseen consequences, twisting events and influencing reality. We may even have an example of this already. Reading this whiteboard, we see one of the ATD's attempt at writing. The words are gibberish, but in a very familiar way. Deep in the investigation sector, at the Fermauro AWE site, an entity named Fra speaks with this same style. Could the ATDs have caused a ripple back through time to cause this event in the first place? Knowledge is knowing how to do something. Wisdom is knowing if you should do something. To turn this phrase, the ATDs will eventually develop the knowledge on how to replicate Alan's style, but they do not possess the wisdom to know if it should. Who knows what horrors could be released upon the world if this project went unchecked? Or maybe it is already too late. Our second example is the presence of Edward Booker. Diana's reason for going this route was due to the ATDs taking too long to produce usable results. The escalation between her and her husband drove her to tamper with the brakes and drive full speed towards her goal. If an AI cannot learn fast enough, why not take another artist and have him recreate Wake's work? The absence of message and emotion in the story will no longer be an issue. The ATD couldn't do this, but Ed can. There is, however, another problem that comes up. In essence, what Ed is tasked with doing is adapt Alan's work into a new story, reading what someone else did and trying to imitate it. This theory crumbles with one simple truth. No two artists have the same literary fingerprint. What Alan puts into a story is not what Ed does. Their interpretation of the text is very different. The subtext for each writer does not reflect the other. This becomes apparent when we hang around and listen to him speak to himself, when Ed interprets the text using his own worldview.
Shadow monsters represent capitalism, which means the flashlight is the power of the artist. Sheer creativity tearing through the shadowy cloak of corporate cookie-cutter bullshit. Killer metaphor.
In a previous video, we discussed how art involves projecting contents of the individual's psyche out into the physical world for others to experience. As a result, analysis is a form of projection. When interpreting a film, a novel, or song lyrics, the audience projects what they believe the content is trying to say. It's impossible to avoid, but it can be mitigated when the ego is not involved in the process. Ed projects his social concerns in his interpretation of Alan's work, the symbols taking on a new meaning, being colored by his projections. But by knowing the history of Wake and the emotional turmoil he was experiencing at the time of writing Departure, we know that Ed's interpretation was not accurate. Departure had one primary theme, but also was written with a very specific purpose. Its theme was the outside influence placed upon the creative process. Hartman trying to control the art of his patients. The Dark Presence manipulated Alan to write what it wanted. Even Emerson left his career in video games because the producers got too involved and forced their vision upon his work. It is a reoccurring theme throughout. That being said, its purpose was only tangentially related to this theme. You see, Alan had writer's block for a couple years leading up to arriving in Bright Falls. Then, his wife was swallowed by the lake. The Dark Presence would take advantage of plot holes, mistakes, and badly thought out subtext to empower itself. These circumstances forced Alan to do two things. 1. He had to write in order to save Alice. And 2. He had to write in a coherent and concise manner, otherwise the Dark Presence would be released. The narrative was structured to force him to overcome his writer's block and produce a story that was logically consistent within the rules of the world. Unlike we, the audience, Ed does not know Alan well. The extent of his knowledge is likely overhearing Tammy mention him from time to time. He is not privy to his personal struggles. As a result, his ability to interpret these stories from the author's perspective are impaired. I mentioned earlier that analysis can become more accurate when the ego is not involved in the process. This means taking yourself out of your own head and getting to know the artist, trying to understand what was going on in their head, what events were happening at the time the story was written, both personally and socially. There is a philosophical dichotomy that emerges when attempting to understand a literary work. That is the distinction between exegesis and eisegesis. While these terms originally applied to analyzing religious scripture, in recent generations it has been expanded to apply to any form of literature. Both of these words are methods of interpretation. Exegesis is allowing the text to speak for itself, to understand the cultural context at the time it was written, to understand what the author intended when writing it. Eisegesis, on the other hand, is when the observer determines what the text means, to twist the original meaning to fit the modern cultural context, to project one's belief onto the story and ignore the author's intention, then pretend as though this is what the author meant all along. To put it more simply, one is what the story actually means, and the other is what the viewer claims the story means. It is easy to interpret a line of text when there is information missing. When reading of a man running, and the internal dialogue is, "running is good," one might presume the character is a fitness junkie. However, once we learn that he just killed a man, the phrase takes on a new meaning. It is why fully understanding a piece of literature sometimes requires us to learn about the author and the historical events occurring at the time the book was written. Eisegesis is a really easy trap to fall into without even realizing it. The reader is only privy to the information of our individual experience. As a result, we see things through our own personal lens rather than through the lens of the author. It is a cognitive bias that we bring into the relationship between art and audience. Abraham Maslow wrote that it is tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. Several years before this, Abraham Kaplan called it the law of the instrument, stating that if you, quote, give a small boy a hammer, he will find that everything he encounters needs pounding. It is easy to see how this applies to eisegesis, bringing our own experience and worldview into the act of interpretation. As a result, what is actually being said can go over our heads. The only way out of this law of nature is to understand that there are other tools out there, to gather more information about a subject matter and not simply default to what we know, to take stock of what tools we have readily available and seek new ones. This is where Ed Booker failed. His own personal history tells us as much. In the lake house, we see background checks that the Marmonts ran on him and Tammy. We learn that she was originally a poet and had little to no success in her chosen literary genre. This is when she changed to true crime and found greater success. Ed, however, was a playwright and found his work not well received. Rather than pivot like his wife did, he kept hammering that nail and failed to achieve success, relying on Tammy financially as a result. In their room at the Bright Falls Lodge, we find more information on Ed's prior work. After witnessing Nightingale's murder and after Tammy left the lodge, he sat down to get his thoughts out. One paragraph is relevant to this discussion. I need to find something. I'm tired of writing one-act plays about how shitty the world is. I thought scathing social commentary would make me feel like a real artist, but I don't know, it's not me. I want to write something weird. Something really out there. Something authentic. But what? Authenticity is the key word here. Ed's prior work were plays that acted as social commentary, the tools in his chest he was used to. But he wanted to change, to create something that was him. Unfortunately, after he was abducted by the Marmonts, his intention here was sidetracked. Rather than create something that is authentic to himself, he was tasked with replicating another artist's work, the opposite of authenticity or originality. In the furtherance of this, he fell into the law of the instrument. Pulling out that well-worn hammer, he immediately turned to his old style, falling into the trap of eisegesis and interpreting Allen's work through the lens of social commentary, injecting anachronistic themes and subtext where they don't belong. If he was not kidnapped by the Bureau, who knows if he would have been successful with his original intention to leave this behind and make something authentic to himself. When Tammy failed at her first attempt, she changed her writing. Now that Ed is attempting to do the same, the universe conspired to prevent it, to give him back the hammer and instruct him to pound away. The purpose of this whole discussion is to illustrate the point that when adapting or recreating a piece of art that came before, something always gets lost in translation, whether that be the new author's misinterpretation of the source material through eisegesis, or new subtext and themes being added where they were not there before. The recreation is rarely authentic to the original. It takes conscious efforts to avoid these traps. In her pursuit of adapting Alan's work to serve her own goals, Diana forgot these principles. First, the ATDs served to create a flawed story with no soul to it. Then, she forced a man to make an adaptation that had a different soul with a thin veneer of wake. Jules telegraphs his intention to use the same techniques and abuse the lake to serve his own ends. To them, this exercise was not simply one that resulted in flawed interpretation. It was done intentionally for the purpose of control. To take someone else's work and twist it to serve them, whether to get a leg up on someone else or change the world to benefit oneself. Their motivations are apparent. They manipulated art to serve a purely selfish purpose. They opened up a box that eventually snapped back, dragging them down into the pit of the dark place. Maybe their hubris can be a parable for those who consider going down the same path. To paraphrase Wake and turn his phrase, a story is not a machine that does what you tell it. A story is a beast with a life of its own. Sometimes when that beast is abused, it will bite back. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, please drop a like and subscribe to receive updates on future uploads. If you would like to help support the channel, a Patreon has been set up and the link is in the description below. Have a great day and peace be with you all.